All right, guys. So this is part 2 of the Anglo-Saxon background notes. So here we're going to be talking about Anglo-Saxon villages and then kind of the fall of the Anglo-Saxons to kind of wrap it up. So Anglo-Saxon villagers, we would have had homes that were built from wood with thatched roofs. And so thatching is where you use reeds or sometimes even turf as your kind of roofing structure, and you weave them together to create something that's largely watertight. Sometimes they would build them, they would put turf actually on top. So you would almost have like sod, like if you've ever like put down like kind of not fake grass in your yard, but this idea of sod. And they would put that on the roof. And one, it gave a place for their animals to graze. But two, it also, kind of was a lot more watertight than some of the roofs that we saw kind of in earlier Anglo-Saxon villages. So it's kind of an interesting little green tidbit there. Your most important structures would have been built from stone because they would have lasted a lot longer. Your church, your granaries, your mead halls, that kind of thing would have been built from stone. It made them a lot more resistant to fire, obviously. Fire in an Anglo-Saxon village was definitely always a problem and something that they would work very hard to make sure that it didn't happen. A lot of times there were only one room because this were a lot easier to build and everybody would just kind of hang out together all of the time. Anglo-Saxon villages were small. We're looking at less than 300 people. And again, they're united around some sort of warlord or chieftain. They would have had a high wooden fence that would circle the entire Anglo-Saxon village. This is to keep out predators, both animals and people, and to kind of keep your livestock and your citizens safe. They were largely agrarian. They farmed, they fished, they kept cattle and fish and pigs and sheep and things like that. And they would trade with travelers from other countries as well. Because again, the Romans built roads, so people would use them. And a lot of those contacts from the kind of Roman Empire continued and would have still used Britain as a place to sell their goods. Village life centered around the hall. So this would have been a really large structure kind of right in the middle of the town. And the chief would live there with his warriors. It'd be the biggest house in the village. It would be where you go if anything bad was happening. So this is an idea of what an Anglo-Saxon village might look like. And this is probably a little bit small. But so we have our high wall, like I said, to keep out your bandits and to keep out your wild animals and things like that. And then this one actually has a double wall. So this would have been a very, very well fortified Anglo-Saxon village. So you've got you've got a stream here you can fish from as well as bring water to your houses. And you have water also adds an additional barrier to any kind of invader. You have water for your animals, and you can fish here, and you've got places for your animals to graze. Then on the inside, we have this kind of center area. This is where a lot of times they would have feasts and things like that, or festivals. They would put up like kind of like a farmer's market on certain days, that kind of thing. And we have our little Anglo-Saxon houses here. You can see that in the back, a lot of them have a space for them to keep pigs or horses or cows or things like that in these small areas. And a lot of times during the winter, these animals would sleep inside with you. One, because it was too cold for them to be outside, and two, because it actually made your house warmer as well to have these kind of animals inside. And then extra fortified up on this hill up here, we have the mead hall, right? So you'll notice it's a lot grander looking than the rest of the area. And it has this little drawbridge and this another extra bit of fencing to keep people out. So if they were attacked and by this outer or inner wall was breached, then everybody would then retreat up to here to be kept safe, and they could pull up the drawbridge. And again, it's very difficult for attackers to lay siege to this when they're only have this like narrow pathway to go through. It really kind of hurts your numbers. You'll notice that we have some wooden structures here, right here, and over here. This was probably the granary, which is where they would keep their grain and things like that. You always want to keep that in a rock or stone structure because grain is highly flammable, and it's your food source, so you really don't want it catching on fire. And then this was probably their church, if I had to guess. Over here, it looks like something more like an inn, just based on the number of windows that there are and the fact that it's 2 stories. And then these would have been some houses around here. And like I said, this is probably the mead hall. So Anglo-Saxon life was both very similar and very different from the Celts. So we have these things called peace weavers, and these were women that were married off to other tribes as a way to kind of create friendship where there was animosity or where there was anger and enemies. So if I've got two warring tribes, one thing I might do if I want to call this to an end, I don't want to war anymore with this other tribe. I've got to find a way to fix this. What I might do is marry off one of my eligible women from my town to an important person over in the other town. And then there's a blood tie between us. So that means that I'm going to be much less likely to attack, and they're going to be much less likely to attack me. So it creates a bond between these two tribes. So that was kind of a way to kind of strengthen things. They also had these things called bards or sops. These are musicians and poets who kept the history of the clan. They were hugely important. So the epic poem that we're going to be reading is called Beowulf, and it's named for the hero of it. And this is the kind of thing that would have been sung by a bard or a sop as a way to entertain people on these kind of like long winter nights. So they were in charge of both keeping the history of the clan, but also these kind of stories that all Anglo-Saxons told. They would have had all of this memorized. It would not have been written down, and it would have been sung, and they would have played like a harp probably to accompany themselves. And they would just keep people enthralled with the stories that they would tell. Um, and then their job would then be to teach somebody else these stories so they could kind of pass them along. Anglo-Saxons also believed that everything was predetermined by fate, that it didn't really matter the choices that you made, but that, your life was probably going to end in a very specific way. And that was because of weird, or what they called fate. Things are out of your control, and they thought of this as three women who weave and cut the thread of a man's life. So that's actually very similar to the fates from Greek mythology. Anglo-Saxon religion, so they were pagan or polytheistic. They were not Christian. They believed in many gods. And they were heavily influenced by Norse and Scandinavian mythology. So it's likely that they were worshiping gods like Odin, Thor, and Freya. Odin was also called Woden at times. So that's where Wednesday comes from. It's called Woden's Day. The irony, actually, we have so many of our days of the week, weirdly enough, come from Norse gods. It's very strange. Odin was the kind of important one. He was the big god. He was the god of death, poetry, and magic. He only had one eye. And he had these two ravens who could see the future. And he would send them around the earth in kind of opposite directions every day. And their job was to go and get information for him and then bring it back and tell him about what's going on so that he could continue to be incredibly powerful. Thor, or Thunor, was the god of thunder and lightning. You're probably very familiar with him because of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And then we have Freya, or Frigg. She was the goddess of love. Friday is Freya's day. Thursday is Thor's day. But eventually the Anglo-Saxons were converted to Christianity. And Hilda of Whitby, was really crucial to the conversion process, and actually ended up becoming a saint because of kind of bringing God to these pagans. So we don't really have any readers, very few readers at this time. A lot of the people that could read were probably just the monks that came in later. And so they had an oral tradition, like I said. It was performed by a bard or a sot from memory in Old English. And a lot of times this is why we have several versions of the same story. So we're just reading one version of Beowulf, right? We don't know who originally wrote it. And we don't even know who translated it and wrote the kind of version that we talk about now, because the authors were unknown, right? So the author of Beowulf is actually just called the Beowulf poet. We know it was a Christian monk who heard, obviously, the story from a bard and then adapted it, wrote it down, and moved it out of Old English. So the end of the Anglo-Saxon period comes because of the Vikings. They were quite a force to be reckoned with. So we have the Norse from Norway and the Danes from Denmark are overcrowded. And they decide that, you know what, there's this big island over to the west of us. Why don't we just take it over, and then we'll have lots of room. They decide to make their way over to the British Isles. The invaded Anglo-Saxons start calling them Vikings. And their kind of invasions start in 1793 and they end in 1066 with the death of the last Anglo-Saxon king, um, which is King Edward. Right, so William the Conqueror, who is a Viking, comes in, kills the last of the Anglo-Saxon kings at the Battle of Hastings in 1066, and they start to introduce several Scandinavian words into Old English. Right, so all of our kind of like short, ugly words come from the Scandinavian. Law, take, cut, anger, frickly, ugly. All of those are words that originated in the Scandinavian, and then were just kind of adapted into Old English. Like I said, the Anglo-Saxon period ends with the death of their last king, King Edward. Okay, so you should be able to finish up your notes at this point, and just make sure that you save those in your journal folder. If you've got any questions, let me know. Bye, guys.